Hi everybody and welcome to week 4. When we talk about reading and the differences in reading between two different alphabetic languages, we're really looking at a couple of different issues. One of those issues is the nature of how words are built. That's known as morphology. As we saw last week, the morphology of English is really quite different from that of Hebrew. A morpheme is the smallest part of a word that has meaning. So when we talk about morphology, how are words built? In English, for example, the word horse consists of one morpheme, but the word horses consists of two morphemes, horse plus plural. As we saw last week, English, it uses a linear morphology. Words are built with prefixes added or suffixes added, but the base remains intact in a linear fashion. And those words are built, block by block. Hebrew works completely differently, as we saw. Hebrew relies on the root word system to create most of its vocabulary. And as a result, there are not only prefixes and suffixes, but there are sometimes what are known as infixes, which is a letter or vowel set that's added in between the letters of the root. And then the words are also highly inflected, meaning that the vowels change greatly and that a change in the vowels changes the meaning. So last week we looked at morphology. This week we're going to look at a couple of other issues. One has to do with the nature of the orthography itself, the very nature of the letter shapes and how they work, and also with the phonemic structure of the language, how it sounds. Stephen Krashen is one of the most important linguists and language teachers in the 20th and 21st century. Not only did he have a remarkable career teaching languages, but he is also the inventor of a teaching methodology that has greatly influenced the way languages are currently being taught and has really formed the basis of what is known as the communicative approach. But as much as I respect Krashen, I do question some of the things he said, and this is one of them. I question the idea that learning to read in one language automatically helps us read in a second. I am not sure that that's true. And while there are certain arguments in favor of Krashen, there are also arguments against him. So the arguments that support this view, one of them can be derived from Gray's definition of reading, being that translating of written symbols into meaningful language. We looked at that definition back in week 1. We also know that when a person learns to read in their first language, that certain neurological pathways get established, and that there is actually an area in the brain, in the back, in the occipital lobe, that is dedicated to analyzing print and sending those printed images along a pathway that goes to the phonological processing center where the sound of the word is invoked, and also to the meaning center where one understands what the word means, and that both of those things happen simultaneously. We know that's true whether you're learning French or Russian or Chinese or Japanese or Hebrew or English. Those neural pathways get established that way. And we also know that an exact replica of that pathway has to be developed for each new language that you learn, a parallel system, as it were, because you need to have the information in Hebrew being processed by the part of the brain that understands what the Hebrew sounds are and what the Hebrew letters and vowels represent. And at the same time, you need a part of the brain that is actually analyzing what the meaning of the Hebrew word is. You don't want to be trying to analyze a Hebrew word in your English vocabulary center. And also, we know that once one understands the concept of reading in one's first language, it's much easier to then understand how reading should work in a second language. Although, therein lies the rub, because the arguments against Krashen are that orthographies differ. And this week we're going to be looking at just how different two alphabetic orthographies are, Hebrew and English. They are radically different from each other, just as the morphology that we looked at last week was so different. There are also issues that arise in what we refer to as transfer of training. Transfer of training is the idea that when you learn a skill or a set of concepts in one area, you should be able to apply those skills or concepts in a different area. But we find that's not always the case, and in fact, it's often not the case. There were a couple of landmark studies of high school students that found just exactly how problematic this is. For example, students in high school did not understand that the formulas and the equations that they were learning in math class could be applied to problems in their science classes. They didn't see how those two items connected because math was math and science was science. Similarly, another study found that they did not understand how learning about writing in a composition course transferred to being able to write in other subject areas. Those two studies, the first was Blanchett and Dunbar from 2002, and the second was Bregman and Zepernik in 2007. Those point out that without specific training to transfer the information from one subject to another, students weren't able to do it. And a third area that is particularly problematic in reading is that learning to read in your first language creates a set of great expectations for how reading is going to work no matter what you do. Students believe that they should be able to read French precisely the same way they read English. That's closer than understanding that you can't read Hebrew the same way you read English. So all of this requires a lot of guidance on the part of the teacher for students to be able to adapt what they know about their first language to learning to read their second language. As I see it, as language teachers, we face three different kinds of challenges today. The first is subject matter challenges. Those are things that we're going to really address this week, as well as things that we looked at last week. There are also environmental issues. The learning environment in the 21st century is very different from where it was in the 20th, the 19th, the 18th, the 17th, and so on. And we have to be aware as teachers, we have to be aware of the environment that surrounds what it is we're doing. And finally, there are individual learner variables, and those can have a profound effect on how successful a student is in learning any specific kind of skill. We'll start with subject matter issues because this is something that we actually can control. We have more control over how the subject matter is presented than we do over anything else. It's also the thing that is most universal. What is true for student A and student B when it comes to the subject matter, that's not going to be a varied issue. But the environment is going to be different. The environment in a day school is going to be very different from the environment in a supplementary school. And different day schools are going to pose different kinds of environments. And different supplementary schools will as well. So the environment itself is going to be more of a variable, and the individual learner variables are going to be as different from one person to another as can be. So we have the most control over the subject matter, and it is the thing that is going to influence every learner. Where Hebrew is concerned, one of the major subject matter issues is the presence of so many visually similar letters. These are the letters that look alike, that students confuse. Dalet and Resh, Bet and Kaf, Vav and Yud, Vav and final Nun, Ain and Tzadi, and so on and so forth. There are just tons of these in Hebrew. English essentially has two pairs, maybe three, P and Q, B and D, M and W, and they're all mirror image type issues. In Hebrew, there are multiple different ways that letters can look alike, and each of those will have to be addressed a little bit. There are also symbols for similar but not identical sounds. We have these in English also. And n are very similar sounds, symbolized by M and N. That's going to be a problem for some Hebrew readers as well. Mem and Nun represent very similar sounds. Zayin and Samech, Samech and Tzadi, Zayin and Tzadi. These are going to be difficult for some students to hear the differences and difficult for them to make the differences, to pronounce the differences. Then there are individual single symbols that serve two purposes. In modern Hebrew, that's the kamatz and the shva. Kamatz katan is o, and kamatz gadol is a, and the shva can either be the tiniest little half vowel sound on the planet, or it can be the absence of a vowel. There are also multiple symbols that represent the same sound. Tet and Taf, Samech and Sin, and so on and so forth. And that can be a source of confusion for students. Hebrew vowels are a whole issue in and of themselves, because while English vowels are represented by letters, Hebrew vowels are tiny little dots and dashes tucked above or below or within the line of print. And some letters also represent certain vowel sounds. That's an adaptation that Hebrew made early on to try to make it so that it was more readable. And then there are letters for sounds that just simply don't exist in English. Chet. There is no ch sound in English. There is in German, but not in English. Another really fascinating one is tzadi. There is no initial ts sound in English. It can appear only in the middle or at the end of a word. Pizza, Betsy, Metz, Betz, Let's. But not at the beginning. There are really only two English words that actually start with that sound, and neither of them are native to the language. One is from Swahili, tsetse fly, and the other is from Japanese, tsunami. These are not organically English words. And then there is the direction. English readers read on a straight line, starting at the left and moving to the right. Hebrew not only goes from right to left, but it goes up and down as well. So that in order to see the vowels, you've got to look above the line of print and below the line of print and through the line of print. It's kind of this zigzag directionality for the eye that learners have to learn how to do. We also know that not all alphabetic systems are created equally. This is one of the other stumbling blocks between the two. English has 26 letters, but they are totally inconsistent in the way they represent sounds. The technical term for this is that English has a deep orthography. Hebrew, by contrast, has 22 letters, 4 that represent 2 sounds, 5 final letters, and 9 vowel signs. But the system is highly regular. This is known as a shallow orthography. In fact, when you have fully vocalized Hebrew, it is one of the most shallow orthographies of any alphabetic system on the planet. The only one that is more shallow than Hebrew is Finnish. And in Finnish, there is literally one symbol per sound and one sound per symbol, period. Hebrew, as I said, has two that represent two different sounds. Hebrew is also quite different visually and in terms of word formation. That's what we looked at last week. And interestingly enough, when Gray was doing his study of how all language reading works with mature, competent readers, even he found that readers of Hebrew and Arabic make longer fixations and more frequent regressions than readers of any European language. And that's interesting because it tells us something about the nature of the visual quality of Hebrew script, and that it requires a longer look and more frequent checks. Last week we looked at the way English reading strategies are basically a factor of dealing with word shapes in English, because the word shapes are really quite different. English rather has words that can be as short as one letter, as long as like 45 letters. I mean, there are some really long chemical names in the English language and disease names that are just really incredibly lengthy. But English has all these ascending and descending letters also, which give English words a very distinctive look. And because of this, it's possible for readers to glance at the beginning of the word and the end of the word, derive the rest of the word from the context of what they're reading, and from the overall shape of the word. That, as we saw last week, is simply not possible in Hebrew, because Hebrew is a root-based system, which means the most words are 3 to 6 letters in length. The longest is about 10. It lacks ascending letters, there's only one, and it lacks descending letters, there's only one except for the finals. And once it's at the end of the word, that doesn't help you any further. So Hebrew words are similar in both length and shape, and the literature describes them as lacking distinctiveness, lacking distinctive features. This brings us to the question of what's the best approach to all of this. And we return again to the different methods for teaching reading that we saw in week 1. Where it comes to Hebrew, there is the traditional method, there is phonics, there's whole word, which is a transfer of how English reading is taught, and there is the normal word method that was developed in Germany. The traditional approach to reading Hebrew really parallels the old alphabet method, with one really wonderful exception, and that is when a child is first introduced to the letters, the teacher smears them with honey, and the child is allowed to lick the honey off of the letters so that they will always associate learning, and in particular Hebrew learning, with something sweet. Barring that, it is exactly the same as the old alphabet method. The students are taught the names of the letters first. So first they learn how to recite the entire alphabet without seeing anything, and then they learn to associate the names of the letters with the individual symbols. And then they master all consonant vowel and consonant vowel consonant syllables first with the letter names, and then they have to relearn the whole thing without the letter names. And we know that this is the approach that was used, partly because of the wonderful old Yiddish folk song Eufen Prepetschik, which describes how the teacher is teaching the children the alphabet, or as they would say, the aleph base. And the teacher has them say Kamatz Aleph Aw, right? That's the way that it was taught. So they would name the vowel, name the consonant, and then produce the syllable. They had to master all of the syllables in the Hebrew language that way. Once they had mastered all of those consonant vowel and consonant vowel consonant combinations and done it twice. They then moved immediately to reading the Bible, beginning with the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus was chosen because it was held that the purity of Leviticus would amplify the purity of children. Fascinating way of deciding which book to start with. You'll note that they always taught the alphabet in aleph-bet order. There's resistance to doing it any other way. That is the traditional method. That is how it's always done. And yet, rather than starting with the first book of the Torah, they start with the book of Leviticus. Gotta love it. Then the students, as they were learning their Bible, would read a line and provide a word-for-word translation, even if it didn't make sense in the language they were translating it into. They had to provide a word-for-word exact translation, and generally this was from Hebrew into Yiddish. It was rote, it was repetitious, and this is how they learned the entire Bible over many, many, many years, leading to the idea that it was pure drudgery. Standing in direct opposition to the traditional method, we find the Chalutzim, the pioneers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the folks who returned to the land of Israel. And they had two very important and somewhat contradictory goals. Goal number one was a return to the land and a return to the image of the Jew that one finds in the Bible. Free people, independent, competent, willing to fight to defend themselves, as opposed to the image of the European Jew. They also, at the same time that they wanted this return to biblical roots, they also wanted to create a new and progressive society. This is because so many of them were heavily influenced by the socialist movements that were spreading across Europe and especially across Eastern Europe. And they wanted to be seen as free, independent, competent people willing to defend themselves and their land while they created a new and totally progressive society. In order to accomplish both of these goals, they rejected everything about European Jewish society, which they thought of as ghetto society. And in no area more did this show up than when it came to education, because the last thing they wanted, these folks had themselves survived the Cheder system. They did not want that for their children. They wanted something new and modern. They saw education as fundamental, as being the key to building this new society. And when they arrived in the land of Israel, they didn't find anything that looked like an educational system in place, so they created their own based on their ideals. The goal was the creation of a Jewish society that was at one time based on the image of the Bible, but also based on progressive ideas and values. And to do this, they were very influenced by the American progressive movement in education, especially by the work of Dewey and Thorndike. And they began to adapt and adopt everything from progressive education and transplant it directly to Israel. This meant that they adopted the traditional whole word method for teaching English. Reading was taught using that system. Hebrew reading was taught that way. And at the same time, even though they rejected tradition for the most part, because they were living in the land of Israel and the Bible was central to their identity, the Bible became a central part of the curriculum of Israeli schools, which it remains today. They not only saw this as connected to the kind of image of the Jew that they wished to portray, but also because they were living in the land where the Bible had been written, where the Bible had grown up. In fact, the whole reference to the importance of the Bible actually shows up even in the opening part of the Declaration of Independence for the State of Israel. Bible is central to Hebrew Jewish education in the land of Israel. Everything seemed to be going along swimmingly until 1948. Well, it seemed to be going along that way. But 1948, everything changed. And most of that change came about because of an enormous growth in population. Between 1948 and 1951, the population of Israel doubled. And between 1951 and 1963, it doubled again. In both instances, the bulk of that population growth came from immigration. But the pattern of immigration radically changed the makeup of Israeli society. Prior to 1948, most immigrants came from Europe, almost exclusively. But after 1948, the bulk of new immigration came from Asia and North Africa. And just to let you know how wild this was, in 1949 alone, 250,000 Jews arrived in Israel. And those new immigrants needed all kinds of social services. Operations Magic Carpet and Operations Ezra and Nehemiah brought in thousands, tens of thousands of Jews from different parts of the world. Operation Magic Carpet brought in 48,000, almost 49,000 Jews from Yemen between June 1949 and September of 1950. And between May of 1951 and January of 1952, just 7 short months, 130,000 Iraqi Jews were brought to Israel with Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. Those demographic changes had profound changes on the makeup of first grade classes. In 1948, you can see about 90% of the kids in school were of European extraction. But with each passing year, those numbers changed. And by 1958, there were more students from Asian and North African descent than there were from European descent. And it continued through the 60s and the 70s. As you could guess, the new state of Israel was totally unprepared for this kind of population explosion. For one thing, there was a total lack of housing. And in response to so many people coming in that needed to be housed and fed, the government set up these ma'abarot, these transit camps, that had really horrifyingly bad living conditions. The top 2 pictures on the left side of the screen are actual pictures from those ma'abarot. They were tent cities, and worse, they sometimes were built out of scrap material. And the conditions within the camps were not good. There was not enough food. There was not enough work. There was a lack of pretty much everything. And suddenly, there started to be reports of reading failures in the public schools, as high as 50% in some areas. And the leadership, the educational leadership at Misrad HaChinuch, the Ministry of Education, attributed all of this to the poor living conditions and lack of parental support found in the camps. And just to let you know how bad the conditions were, the 2 top pictures on the left are actual photographs from those camps, from 2 of the ma'abarot. You can see they're tent cities. In some places, they were put together with scrap lumber and tin. Really not good housing for people coming in. The picture at the bottom is actually a still from a movie, Salah Shabati, which was was the first film that was actually nominated for an Academy Award in the International Division. It's Israel's first entry. The film was written by a guy named Ephraim Kishon, who used to do these great satirical cartoons for the Jerusalem Post. And the movie starred Chaim Topol, who later made his fame in America playing Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. So this particular picture is from that movie, and if you get the chance to see it, it is worth seeing. It's poking fun at what was a really serious problem in terms of absorbing new immigrants. Now, those immigrants came from very traditional societies and were really completely unprepared to deal with a modern European-style, American-style educational system. What they were accustomed to was religious learning only, and religious learning for boys. They had no tradition whatsoever of reading and writing for secular purposes, and scant traditions of learning for women. And suddenly they were thrust into a kind of regimented classroom setting for which the parents were unable to provide any kind of assistance. By 1952, reading failure rates of 50% and more were becoming common, especially in the immigrant areas, and it prompted the Henrietta Zold Institute to hire a researcher to figure out what was really behind the failure rates. The person they hired was a graduate student named Dina Feidelson. She was doing her doctorate at Hebrew University, and she was in particular studying the Jews from the Kurdish community that were living in the Ma'abarot. So she already had street cred with the immigrant populations and was already a known entity among the folks that were living in these depressed conditions. And at the same time, she was also formerly an elementary school teacher, so she understood everything about how Hebrew was being taught in the school system in Israel. So she used an anthropological approach, and part of this was that she was an anthropology student studying a group of people, so this is the approach that she used in the research on education. She did home observations and home visits, and she interviewed the parents. She also interviewed the teachers. She did 3 evaluations of the students over the course of a year, and she did classroom observations, analyzing the methods that were being used, and correlating the method of instruction for each class with the performance of the students on the evaluations. She had a bunch of classes that she was doing this with. Most of them were in immigrant areas, but one was a control class in a totally middle-class neighborhood, a long-established school with students whose families had been in Israel for quite a while. And after all of this analysis, she concluded that the cause of reading failure had nothing to do with the bad living conditions in the Ma'abarot, had nothing to do with the traditions of learning that were new. It had everything to do with the method of instruction, that was the primary cause of the failure. She published her research in Megamot, which was and is the journal in Israel that's used for education and psychology, social services, social sciences, and she won the Israel Prize in 1953, the Israel Prize for Education, the first year that it was awarded. And you can see her in the bottom picture accepting the Israel Prize from the President of Israel. She was the first woman, and she was the youngest person, I think to this date, ever to receive the prize. So if the method of instruction was the cause of reading failure, this begs the question of why had that method worked prior to 1948? During her study in '52, when she was conducting home observations and parent interviews, Vitalson found the answer. The parents in the control class, that middle class neighborhood established school, those parents knew everything about what went on in their children's school day. She interviewed one mother who knew not only that the child had been tested, but knew which answer the child had missed on the test. The kid apparently did not understand the meaning of the word to melt. So what did mom do? She took care of that in a hurry. She made tea, she put in a sugar cube and watched it with the child, and watched it as it melted into the tea. And her line was, "You can be assured that he understands what the word melts means now." The parents were able to provide very sophisticated assistance to their children. One father noted that when his son was home from school and they realized that he couldn't read, Dad sat him down and taught him phonics. That kind of sophisticated parental assistance, first of all, the awareness of everything that was going on in their children's educational lives, but also the ability to provide assistance where needed, that was something that the new immigrants were absolutely not able to provide. So it took until 1958 for the Ministry of Education to take matters at hand and figure out a solution to the problem. Now, to be fair, they had to deal with the housing issue, the employment issue, making sure that there was enough food for everybody, getting medical care for everyone, and oh yeah, by the way, fighting a couple of wars. So I can't fault them too much, but as an educator, once you know that there's a problem, we'd hope that they would immediately try to tackle it and find a solution. It took a little while. By that time, Vitalson was a professor, and she was tapped to lead one of the teams that was charged with investigating the situation and, in particular, finding a solution to it. So Vitalson and her team began with an error analysis. They asked the question, what is it that's difficult for students to learn about Hebrew reading? This is the question I asked you in last week's forum. What errors do you find your students commonly make? They found a list, visually similar letters. That was giving kids all kinds of problems. Symbols that represent similar but not identical sounds, like tzadi and samech. Different symbols that represent a single sound, like taf and tet, or sin and samech. Single symbols that represent more than one sound, and the vowels. Oh, the vowels. So Vitalson's team conducted classroom experiments to find out the best approaches to teaching Hebrew reading instruction. They had a set of classes that they were allowed to experiment with. Each team actually was given classrooms where they could try out their theories. Vitalson's team actually divided the classes into 3 categories. One group, they taught one way. They always introduced things concurrently. One group, they always introduced things one right after the other, and the third group, they always separated things widely. And they focused on the sequence of introduction for those vowels and letters that we all know are problematic, paying special attention to the ones that cause the most errors. And after that, they also looked at the patterns for reading drills. So there were 3 instructional sequences, 3 possible sequences. Vitalson's team did, with one group, they did concurrent introduction. The items were introduced together. Dalet and Reish were taught at the same time. Bet and Kaf were taught together, and the teacher was allowed to highlight the differences between them. A second group was given a sequential introduction where one item was introduced one day and the next item was introduced right afterwards. So in this case, Dalet would be presented on Monday, Reish on Tuesday, Bet on Wednesday, Kaf on Thursday. And the third group was given a kind of separated sequential introduction. That is, Dalet was introduced on September 1st, and Reish was introduced in November. Bet was introduced on September 20th, and Kaf was introduced in January. And they were separated by lots and lots and lots of neutral symbols that the students wouldn't confuse. So, Hebrew has all of these pairs of visually similar letters, tons of them. There are more than 30 pairs of letters that have only one tiny difference between them. Bet, the bottom bar extends a little bit to the right while Kaf is rounded on the bottom. The Zayin, the top bar, is a little bit more angular than it is for the Vav. The Reish, the top bar is rounded, but it's extended a little bit to the right on Dalet. One tiny difference. Then there's a category of letters that share a general overall shape. This is something that I think a lot of native readers have trouble understanding why American readers have trouble with it. And it's because, again, this goes back to those English reading strategies where students are taught to recognize things at a glance. If you just glance at these things, their overall shape is very similar. Mem and Tet, they both have two peaks on the top, and they both have a long base on the bottom and arms on the right and the left, arms on each side. The difference is that Tet is open at the top and Mem is open at the bottom. That's it. Otherwise, their overall shape is identical. Same is basically true with Ayin and Sadi. Both of them have a base with two branches reaching up on the top. If you're not looking at them really carefully, it's very easy to confuse them. And the third category is three pairs of letters that are similar when rotated. Bet and Taf, Fe and Tet. If you have students that are confusing these kinds of letters, it means that they have real orientation issues, and they're going to need a lot of extra, really one-on-one intervention to be able to master reading. So, when thinking about visually similar letters, letters that look similar, what do you think is the best way to go? Do you want door number 1, concurrent introduction? Door number 2, sequential, where one is introduced one day and the next is introduced the next day? Or door number 3, where those items are widely separated? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to think about this, answer this question for yourself, and then I'll show you what the research says. Vitelson's team found that you need to widely separate visually similar letters. That if they were introduced together or one right after the other, it actually increased that the students would confuse them. And keep in mind, this is all being done in Israel, where kids see this print every day of their lives. Imagine how much more so this is going to apply to an American setting where they see Hebrew much, much, much less. There are also Hebrew letters that represent similar but not identical sounds, like Tzadi, Zayin, and Samech, or Chet and Kaf, Ch and K, very similar, or Mem and Nun, N. There are about a dozen pairs of consonants and vowel sounds that are similar. So again, we have the question, which is the best way to do this? Should you introduce these sounds together, these symbols and sounds together, concurrent introduction? Should it be sequential, one right after the other, or widely separated? Again, take a couple of seconds. Again, the team found that you should widely separate the similar sounding letters and vowels. As is true with the visually similar items, introducing the similarly sounding items together or one right after the other actually increased the likelihood of confusion. We also have multiple symbols that represent a single sound. For example, we have regular and final versions of these 5 letters. But there are also pairs of unrelated symbols that represent the same sound. Ayin and Aleph, historically not the same at all, but in modern Sephardi Israeli Hebrew, essentially both are considered silent. Vav and Vet, both make a V. Sin and Samech, Kaf and Kuf. These letters are not related to each other, and yet they represent the same sound. And finally, there are combinations. So Chet, Chaf, and Chaf, final Chaf, basically represent the same sound. Tet, Taf, and Taf represent the same sound, as do the vowels, right? We have Patach, Chataf Patach, and Kamatz, Kamatz Gadol. They all represent the same sound. So again, I ask, when you have multiple symbols that represent a single sound, should they be taught concurrently? Should they be taught one right after the other? Or should they be widely separated? Take again a couple of seconds to think of what your answer to this is. Feidelson's teams found that when you have multiple symbols that represent a single sound, you should teach them together. When they were introduced sequentially, the learners would recall one but not the other. And typically, the less common symbol was most often forgotten. So, for example, Tet was not recalled, but Taf was. And that's compounded when the letters are visually similar, like Tet and Mem, or like final Mem and Samech, or Sin and Shin. Next, we come to the issue of 2 sounds represented by a single symbol. This is a place where English can make you crazy, because there are so many symbols in English that can represent multiple sounds. It sometimes feels like there are more exceptions than there are rules in English. So, for example, we have GHOTI. This is a word that is widely attributed to George Bernard Shaw. Is part of his case for spelling reform in English. Actually, there's evidence that Shaw never said it, and that it was actually someone before him that came up with this. But the idea is that English is so inconsistent in the way it spells things that GHOTI could be fish. The way that would work is the GH is from enough, the O is from women, I, and the TI is from motion, sh, ish, fish. Hebrew, fortunately, has only 2 letters and 2 vowels in this category. The He can either be a H, an aspirated consonant, or it can be an assist for a vowel. The Yud can either be Y, or it can also indicate vowels. Kamatz, there is Kamatz Gadol, which is A, or Kamatz Katan, which is O, and the Shva, which can be Shva Na, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny little half vowel, a semi-vowel, or the indication of Shva Nach that there is no vowel. So again, we ask the question, what's the best way to introduce these 2 symbols, or it's one symbol that represents 2 things? Do you teach both of these uses concurrently? Do you teach one on day 1 and the other the next day? Or do you widely separate them? Again, take a couple of seconds. Wilson's team found that you need to widely separate them. Because they represent 2 sounds, they should be treated as symbols that represent similar sounds. And that's especially important because these items are most often cited as being causes of problems for beginning readers. So the best practices with introductory sequences are, if they look similar, widely separate them. If they sound similar, widely separate them. If you have two symbols that are one sound, teach them together. If you have one symbol for two similar sounds, widely separate them. So for the most part, you widely separate with strings of neutral symbols in between, but if they are two symbols that represent a single sound, you teach them together. Those are the most effective introductory sequences. Now, there has been resistance to this research. I know this from years of conducting workshops with reading teachers. There are teachers that believe you can compare and contrast look-alike letters and highlight the differences. And you can do that, but that won't help readers differentiate between them, because learning them together and then being able to distinguish them, that is not how the human brain actually works. What we know from neuroscience is that the brain stores similar things together. We know this from a variety of sources, but one of them in particular is what happens when people suffer a small stroke, a slight stroke. There was a report of a gentleman who had a tiny little stroke. It took out just a few, millimeters of brain matter. But he lost the vocabulary for all fruits and vegetables because they were all stored in that one little tiny space. They were stored together because they were similar. That's how the brain organizes things. It does it by similarity. So animals all get stored in the same basic place. Mammals are in one string and fish are in another string. And because they're with water, water gets its own string, and so on and so forth. Just as the brain stores things by similarity, it retrieves them by differences. So if something is taught together, you increase the likelihood it's going to get stored together. This is why when you have two symbols that represent the same sound, you should teach them together. They'll reinforce each other in the learner's storage system. But when they are similar but not identical, storing them together will actually make it harder to retrieve them. You want to make sure that they get stored very separately. We know that the same basic thing happens with learning physical skills. When learners try to learn how to swing a baseball bat and a golf club at the same time, they can't do either one very well. It leads to what is known as negative transference or interference, so that neither skill gets learned well. And the reason for this is probably because the same neural pathways, or very similar, very close ones, are involved. And when that happens, you can't teach them both at the same time and expect that one little narrow pathway to be able to distinguish which motion should be used at what time. It also works best when one skill is mastered first. When that happens, learning a second skill is actually facilitated by having learned the first one. The same thing is basically true with concepts, with learning conceptual material, and it's certainly true with learning different letters. The second issue that Feidelson's team looked at was the vowels and the drill patterns of the vowels. Now, vowels are problematic in every language. They cause more problems in English reading than consonants do, and they cause lots more problems in Hebrew reading than consonants. In fact, vowels have been attributed in one study as causing as many as 33% of all the reading errors in beginning Hebrew reading. And that's partly because, unlike English, where they're actually represented by letters within the line of print, In Hebrew, the vowels are really a problem. They're tiny. They're little dots and dashes. They're hiding below the line, above the line, very rarely within the line. You have to be looking for them, and it can be a real hunt for the vowels. So Feidelson's team looked at two possible drill patterns. Really, there are only two. The question is, do you drill one consonant with every vowel, like bo, be, boo, ba, be? Or do you drill one vowel with every consonant, like ba, ga, da, ha, ah? Take a couple of seconds and think this through. Feidelson's team actually found that you should drill a single vowel sound with every consonant. Ba, ga, da, ha, ah was a more effective drill strategy for beginning readers than the other, where you would drill each consonant with every vowel. It actually makes a certain kind of sense because it assists the learner in understanding the patterning of how the consonants and vowels work together. If you think about it, even in English reading and phonics classes, students are given a set of words where the vowel and the second consonant remain the same and only the initial consonant changes. Those are the kinds of reading drills that really assist English reading students, and focusing on one vowel and drilling it with each consonant, that's a strategy that works best for Hebrew reading. So if you look at this old primer, this is from the 10th century. This is a primer that was actually found in the Cairo Geniza. And if you look at it, you can see that this is a way that, this is a book that actually promotes the traditional or alphabet method. The letters are taught in alphabetical order. Aleph is followed by Bet, followed by Gimel, followed by Dalet, followed by Hey. And it is what you will see is that not only is this characteristic of the alphabetic method, but the drill pattern is also characteristic of that method. Ba, ba, be. It's drilling a single consonant with every vowel, which we know is not the correct way, or not the way that is most likely to lead to success. So as we've seen, it's really important to focus in on the mechanics of how Hebrew letters and vowels are introduced, how drills for reading are done. But it's also important to remember that Hebrew is a language and that reading is a language skill. So minimally, letters and vowels should be introduced within the confines of a key word. Keywords are really a wonderful thing because they use phonemes in a real life context. A student who is learning the word mishpacha and understands what it means will have a greater shot at remembering what the letter mem makes, what sound it makes, because it's the beginning of the word mishpacha. And it also provides them a mechanism for verifying a word that, or a sound that they may not remember. They may not remember the pei, what sound it makes, but if they know the word mishpacha, they'll remember that the pei makes a p, because that's the sound within the letter. Or that the shva underneath the shin, the shva inside the middle of a word, most often represents the lack of a vowel sound rather than a short one. It's also much more interesting, and providing language as the framework for all of this actually does increase the student's interest in learning it. I would also recommend using additional vocabulary. I think that's a really important piece in all of this, that as a student learns mishpacha, it's really nice for them to learn about everybody that's in the mishpacha. Abba, Ima, Ben, Bat, Saba, Savta, Kelev, Chatul, all of the members of the family. And it's a great way to build vocabulary at the same time that you're helping them learn to read. My caveat is, it's best to introduce this vocabulary only after they have had all these letters and vowels introduced in a much more structured manner. So all of this brings me to a sheet that I'm providing for you to use in evaluating different Hebrew primers. So the question is, are there activities that assist in developing visual skills? Are the letters and vowels that look similar separated with strings of neutral symbols? Are the letters and vowels that sound similar separated? Are the ones that represent identical sounds taught together? Are individual vowels drilled with each consonant? And is decoding taught within a framework of the language? And I give you a very simple 2-1-0 rating system for you to use. You'll get a copy of this sheet for you to use on the assignment that you'll be doing for this week in class, where you're actually going to be looking at the introductory sequences and the reading drills from different primers and making a decision about whether or not this is a way that should be used, the approach that should be used for you in terms of teaching Hebrew decoding. So all of this is a way of looking at subject matter issues, and it highlights the fact that you need to really select books carefully, make sure that the instructional sequences follow the research findings, make sure that the vowels are drilled appropriately, and make sure that language is incorporated minimally through the presence of key words. All of these subject matter issues can be addressed by the book that you use to teach. Environmental issues also are things that we have to talk about. Most of our Hebrew students, especially in supplementary settings, don't understand what they're reading. There's also just not enough instructional time. By the way, that is a universal truism in Jewish education. Day school teachers feel that there is not enough time to teach everything they have to teach in a day school. Teachers in 3-day-a-week supplementary schools feel that there's not enough time to teach everything they want to. And it gets worse as you get to a 2-day-a-week or a 1-day-a-week school. We know that English reading strategies, which students are going to try to use, they are not helpful. And right now there is an increasing problem of students not having anyone at home who can provide assistance. So with the environmental issues, the parents can't read Hebrew. This is brought about by two things. One of them is the increasing rates of intermarriage, and also by the fact that there is a gender gap in Jewish education. That gender gap persists. The fact that there's not enough time. We know that a number of schools have actually reduced the hours of instruction. 3-day-a-week schools have reduced to 2 days a week. 2-day-a-week schools have reduced to 1 day a week. And there are schools that are meeting even less frequently than that. We also know that there have been significant changes in the public school curriculum. That not only is the whole word method used, but also whole language, which presents even more difficulties for learning how to read Hebrew. And at the same time, the schools have cut out recitation practice. When I was a kid, we used to get these poems that we had to be able to recite in front of the class. This was a required thing. It happened at least a couple of times a year. That's gone out of the curriculum the same way that cursive writing is going out of the curriculum. There just isn't enough time to teach it and everything else that public schools are now being required to do. There has been historically a gender gap in Jewish education. Typically, boys were required to learn how to read Hebrew all the way through bar mitzvah, and they were in some kind of Jewish educational setting through that time. Girls typically, in traditional societies, didn't get an education. They learned at home. Mostly, they did not learn how to read Hebrew. There were exceptions, and there were at times schools that were set up, but for the most part, girls had less of a chance to get an education in literacy skills. This also translated to American supplementary Jewish education, where girls frequently attended Hebrew school or Jewish school only through the primary years, and by third grade they had dropped out. So they learned a little bit about the Bible and they learned a bit about the holidays, but they never got a chance to learn how to read Hebrew. This had a profound effect because it meant that 50% of the family, the adults in the family, did not know enough Hebrew to help kids with their homework. It meant only dad knew how to read Hebrew. We add to that the intermarriage rate, where you then have one parent who is not Jewish, and you end up with a situation where more kids are in a situation where there's not a chance that anyone can help them. So the effects of the gender gap and intermarriage have bigger consequences when it comes to Hebrew reading than it does to most other parts of the curriculum. At the same time, we have seen big changes in the secular school curriculum. Whole language is now one of the predominant methods for teaching English reading, and as inappropriate as whole word is for teaching Hebrew, whole language is even worse. We know that those English reading strategies that they learn with whole word don't work in Hebrew, and in supplementary schools, the fact that no recitation is done in the public schools means that the kids don't learn those recitation skills there, and we then would have to be responsible for teaching it to them. At the same time, I always like to think of the glass as being half full. There are ways that we can combat the fact that we have reduced instructional time. We can maximize what we have. We can have specialists who come in, and while the specialist is working with the group, the teacher can work with an individual who is struggling or a student who is absent to help get them caught up. Another thing we can do is make full use of the time that we do have, which means starting class on time. This is a bugaboo of mine in supplementary Jewish education. When kids' carpools are arriving, you know, one comes on time, one comes 1 minute late, one comes 2 minutes late, and so on. You have this string of kids disrupting the class coming in late. Makes it hard to start on time. By the same token, the kids that are there on time are cheated if they don't get class started on time. It sends a message that it's not important enough for you to start it on time. Why should they be there on time? So I have often told teachers that the best strategy they can effect is to begin their class on time, and further, to begin the class with the kids' favorite activity. If there's a game that they all love and look forward to, and you've been using it as the reward at the end of the day, use it instead at the beginning. Play their favorite thing at the beginning of class. It will motivate the kids to get their parents to get them there on time. Another option that we have available is using technology. There are a number of apps. Some of them are better than others, but you can find the ones that are best and use them to help support what you're doing in class. We have more options available that way. And finally, we can increase instructional time by actually increasing the amount of time that people spend together. This is based on an idea that was really popular in New York City about 20 years ago. There was a Jewish language club. They would meet once a month for dinner at a kosher restaurant, and the only requirement was that you had to speak, the entire time you had to speak a Jewish language. Could be Yiddish, could be Ladino, could be Hebrew. You could switch back and forth during the course of the meal, but you had to do all your communicating in a Jewish language. We could easily create that kind of a situation within schools now, where once a month families could get together for a family Hebrew evening, where they would share a meal and the entire discussion would have to be conducted in Hebrew. There are other things we can do to counter the effects of a difficult environment. We can emphasize Hebrew reading strategies and remind our students not to use what they've learned about English. We can link vocabulary to root words. That's particularly important in a day school kind of setting or any setting where you're teaching a language component. Make sure that the students understand that there is a root system and how it works. And the best way to do that is, as they're learning new vocabulary, to link it back specifically to its root letters. In a supplementary school, we can add recitation practice. We can provide Hebrew instruction or opportunities for parents, like I mentioned, and utilize technology and maximize our own time. Finally, there are learner issues, individual learner issues. A friend of mine, colleague of mine, Orna Lenchner, and I once had a discussion about the fact that some kids, no matter how bad the program is, some kids will learn to read, and other kids, no matter how good the program is, they won't learn to read. And we came up with what we call the 10-80-10 rule. 10% of your class is going to be so strong visually, such good visual learners, that no matter what you do, no matter what sequences you use, they'll learn it. It'll come to them like a natural thing. And 10% is going to be so hard for them that no matter how good the program is, no matter how much you follow all the guidance on instructional sequences, they're going to struggle. And then there's the 80% of the class in between. So the goal here is to make the 80% more like the top 10% and less like the bottom 10%. Other learner variables are age and prior experience with Hebrew, an individual's tolerance for frustration. This is true of language learning in general. The higher your tolerance for frustration, the more success you're going to have. Interest and motivation. Motivation is something that teachers have the greatest amount of control over in language teaching, and it's one of those things that is most often ignored. And also remember that transfer of training is really important. We have to be able to show our students how things apply in different situations and different contexts. All of this is why the selection of materials is such a crucial thing. If 90% of your students succeed in mastering Hebrew reading, you are way, way, way ahead of the game. So you want to do everything you can to maximize that group in the middle. And if you do all of this, you may find that Stephen Krashen can be correct, that learning to read in one language may actually help with learning to read in a second language, as long as you make sure to apply the research and use that as the building blocks for your Hebrew second language reading instruction program.